Thank you very much, Maddalena. It is really special to be invited to speak at such an important event. I thank the organisers very much for the invitation, and extra special to be introduced by Maddalena. In fact, I remember when I first arrived in Italy, I had an external supervisor, Antonio Marazzi at Padova, who said to me, "You're coming to do anthropology on Italians in Italy?" And I had no idea, really. I've called this paper Emotional Geographies of Kinning and Caring Across the Waves, a Century of Italian-Australian Transnational Social Fields. And as the title suggests, what I want to try to do is map out a longitudinal perspective of changes over time, both within and between the various waves of Italian migration to Australia. And a longitudinal perspective also invites the question of how the Italian-Australian diaspora relates to other Italian diasporas, something that this wonderful series of conferences allows us to examine. Now, the first half of my paper is more conceptual, theoretical, and the second half is more storytelling, ethnographic case studies, and so on. So bear with me through the first half, and it's more fun at the second half. Italian labour migration to Australia, and I've heard a couple of people mention this already in discussions, has often been defined as the final chapter in the massive 25 million departures from Italy between 1861 and 1965. As you know, more than half of those departures were headed for neighbouring European countries like Germany and Switzerland, and it was just under 1% that came to Australia. But being the final chapter, we're also the youngest population, and that makes it very interesting to consider what's happening here. Now, first question, I guess, to ask is, how am I defining the waves? And I think I'm using a very standard structure here. The first wave being a relatively small but foundational pre-war cohort. And I just want to reflect a moment on the inspiring panel organised by Francesco Riccati last night on revising the Italian migration colonial story. And I think the images of the pre-war in particular speak to that history of Italian migrant as coloniser, although the word that is commonly used for these images is pioneers. And what a great term to erase that history, pioneer, not coloniser. The second cohort is the largest and most substantial post-war arrivals in the 50s and 60s. And then there's a smaller post-1970s cluster, shall we say. But since that period, we have now a recent new post-2000 migration of mainly working holiday visas, who are actually arriving in numbers greater than in the post-war period, which I didn't believe until I saw the statistics. So the arrival of these new migrants makes it necessary to revise the final chapter thesis. You know, I thought for a while that Italian migration studies were more or less coming to an end, and then they've been revitalized with this new chapter. So we need to begin to consider their role in this ongoing story. And they are also having a dramatic impact in academia, and we're hearing many of their voices at this conference today. What an enriching development it's been. Especially interesting is the relationship between the new arrivals and the earlier migrants, as well as the second and third migrant generations, to consider intra-community or intra-diaspora relations, including across the diasporas, where there is both mutual support and exchange, as well as competition for scarce resources, and, most interesting of all, to my mind, contestation over identity and belonging. Who is Italian? Who is a real Italian? What does it mean to be Italian? I've witnessed quite a few tense conversations. But also, mapped out onto this longitudinal perspective, I'm interested in the ageing of the community and of individuals, drawing on a current ARC project called Ageing and New Media, which is now entering its third and final year, And I'll be drawing on some of the data from this project in the second half of my presentation, some of which is quite raw and hasn't been cleaned, and you'll see that in some of the quotes. So this project aims to promote digital literacy and digital citizenship for social inclusion, social engagement and access among older people, including Italian migrants. And it's a bit like back in the 50s when we were promoting Italian language classes for migrants. Now we're promoting digital literacy, which is another form of citizenship, extremely important, and I'll come to talk more about that later. Ageing is, of course, a critical issue for both Italy and Australia, as well as globally. And this graph presents the 2016 Australian Italy-born age stats, which reveal the classic inverted pyramid of an ageing population, with over 65% of Italy-born over 65 years of age. Now, it's interesting to consider how those new post-2000 migrants may impact on this age pyramid if they stay longer term, but at the moment, this is the inverted pyramid of an ageing population. I'm also interested in reviewing the longitudinal comparison of cohorts from the point of view of older Italians today who have lived across the different waves. So I've tried to represent that by using the same individuals, pre-war, post-war, down to today. Now, this is still very much a work in progress, but already it has made me aware that there is another kind of migration that occurs over the life course that can be every bit as challenging as the migration from home to host land. And that is the transition to old age, which often involves similar losses to migration, of independence, of governance, of mobility, of social networks, of agency, of literacy, if you think about digital literacy. For example, reflecting on moving into a residential care home, one man said to me, "I feel like I'm having the migration experience all over again." It's also interesting to consider older people's conceptions of identity and community, because they have lived through various manifestations of identity politics, both in Australia and in Italy. And I want to return to that point if I get to there at the end of the paper. So dividing up the cohorts according to age is another interesting dimension to explore. In the older persons cohort are included people who arrived as second generation migrants pre-war, like the people in the first picture, as well as others who arrived as young adults post-war. Then there are even some recent parent migrants. So it's a very heterogeneous group, older migrants. And I want to try and compare the experience of the 1.5 pre-war generation to the first generation post-war, who are similar ages. Similarly, younger Italian Australians today include second and third generation post-war migrants, second generation post-1970s migrants, and new migrants. And they're all also very different if we slice the longitudinal spectrum up according to age. The experiences of youth in the context of mobility and transition is a focus of study in a new ARC project I'm involved in with Anita Harris and Shanti Robertson called Youth Mobilities. In this project, we're exploring the impact of mobility on transitions to adulthood, because mobility is now such a large part of young people's lives. And often mobility experiences are used because of or instead of delayed standard or traditional transitions, for example, marriage or entering the labour force. If you don't have a job, you might have a mobility experience. So you may be wondering why a project on ageing and one on youth. Well, in part it's the result of a longitudinal perspective, but also what links my role in both projects is a focus on the transnational dimension, and in particular families. And that's what most of my talk will be about. This YMAP project has only just begun, and we're recruiting PhD students in Sydney and Melbourne very soon, so if you know anyone who might be interested, please send them my way. The UWA, and I'm based at UWA in Perth, the UWA PhD has just been appointed, actually a former research associate from Prato, which is just really wonderful. And she's going to examine youth migration from Italy to Australia and vice versa. And the numbers of youth mobility are just, compelling. And I know that we'll be hearing from Maddalena on Italian young people migrating abroad from Italy tomorrow, as well as others, I'm sure. So the stats, like the ageing stats, are just demanding our attention. And this also brings me to reflect on, the value of this series of conferences and the opportunity that it offers to draw on both the Italian emigration and immigration literatures, something that curiously does not happen enough. And I think a focus on the transnational social field and its transcultural dimensions is one way to do this. So I argue that these transnational and transcultural social fields create what I call, and what geographers call, emotional geographies, defined as social relations with people and place, mediated by feelings and sensibilities, but shaped by social and historical contexts. I'm particularly interested in responding to the conference theme, Diaspore Italiane, Italy in Movement, by examining the transnationalism and transculturalism from below. In other words, the quotidian and micro level of family and caring. And how do I do this? How do I define this? I operationalize the notion of transnational and transcultural social fields by examining the practices and processes of transnational families. These are families who are separated by distance, or families who have members living in different countries, but still hold together and have a sense of familyhood. And I imagine that most people in this room are members of transnational families, if not everyone. So they're increasingly common, particularly in migrant populations. Now, the exploration of the transnational social field began with the so-called mobility turn in the social sciences and in migration studies in particular. However, the mobility turn is also integrally and intimately linked to a technology turn. Here, I am referring to the massive transformations in travel and communication technologies, digital media, internet platforms that are used to exchange care across distance and that facilitate cultural engagement in new ways. This includes the age-old technologies. All communication is mediated. So the age-old technologies are the postal letter, snail mail, we now call it, and landline phones, right through to the new information and communication technologies, the smartphones, the various apps like WhatsApp and Viber, to programs like Skype, Zoom, social networking sites like Facebook and Instagram and so on, but also memorial sites and virtual communities. And I'm interested in what this does to our notions of identity, belonging, attachment to place, community. So I examine how changing media and what are called new polymedia environments. These are environments where for the first time in history we have a set of options about how we might stay connected across distance. We don't just have the letter or just the phone line. Now we have multiple different ways of staying in touch across distance using new media, and this introduces a moral element. What media will I use and why? And is it okay to send a text message that says happy birthday to my mother? Or do I still need to phone her? And if you get it wrong, what happens? So I ask, how has these polymedia environments impacted our ability to care for both people and places across distance? So my questions are, how have polymedia environments changed over time? And how has new media provided us with new forms of care exchange? What do these transformations mean for transnational and transcultural identities? Now, both the mobility and technology turns are implicated in our relationship to and our conceptualization of place. Both are a large factor in the shift from migration frames, and here I'm going to argue in a very summary way that migration frames featured dislocation, distance, and straight line theories of assimilation of identity, which are very evident in earlier representations of migration, like some of these older monuments to migration. The migration frame and its assimilationist assumptions gave way to the transnational frame, which features connectivity, continuous flux, and in Australian politics of identity contexts, tends to feature mixed and hyphenated identities. You can see something of these changes from the migration assimilationist frame to the transnational mixity, hybridity, hyphenated frame in the monuments featured in this slide. And I want to just make a little aside to the Innisfail cane cutter made in Carrara marble, imported from Italy, which is an example, I think, of what Rita was calling multi-directional memory. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rita. Again, the pioneer myth so evident in that representation of early Italian migration, erasing the colonial history. The inscription on that Innisfail monument is "Ubi bene, ibi patria," where the living is good, that is my homeland. Now, transnational framing has more recently been challenged by notions like superdiversity, hypermobility, cosmopolitan and global citizenship, which link the transnational and the transcultural. And I think I'm particularly interested in work that challenges the either-or distinction between essentialist or constructivist approaches to culture and identity. And what's happening in Europe has really brought this to the fore for Australian scholars. We've become, I think, complacent, or we can become complacent about Australian multicultural frames permitting mixity. And that's not happening easily in Europe. And understanding that has meant that Italian immigration scholarship has been especially interesting in this regard. And Enzo Colombo is an important leader in this field who'll be keynoting tomorrow, with the idea that individuals can simultaneously embrace essentialist and constructivist markers of identity. That's quite new to Australian scholarship because we've been versed in mixity and hybridity. So this idea that you can simultaneously juggle essentialist and constructivist notions has come to us from the Italian immigration literature. So for example, young second-generation Chinese migrants in Italy today talk about feeling simultaneously both an essentialist form of Chineseness and an, albeit contested, connection to Italy, rather than a hyphenated or mixed identity, which is more familiar to Australian second-generation discourses. Now, national politics of identity are arguably the main drivers of this, and I have argued elsewhere about the importance of the role of the ethnicity concept in facilitating hyphenated conceptions of Australian identity that have been foundational to the success of multicultural politics here. And I recommend to you Anthony Moran's new book, The Public Life of Australian Multiculturalism. It sounds like a boring read, it's a page-turner, where he really, in detailed fashion, proves that Australian multicultural policies has permitted this idea that we can be Australian as well as other things. For example, in the hundreds of interviews collected in research projects that I've been a part of over the last 3 decades, most migrants define themselves along a spectrum of Italian Australianness. So Australianness contains diversity. You can be both Italian and Australian. And notions of mixity are well accepted in Australian discourses, public, popular, academic, political. Although I'm not sure this is the best image to convey this, because you'll all have a slight heart attack. But this spaghetti pie was the cover of an anthology of second-generation Italian-Australian writing, organised by second-generation Italian-Australians some years ago. For those of you who are not familiar with Australian cuisine, the pie is the quintessential Australian food. And spaghetti, of course, is the quintessential Italian food. Fortunately for all of us, this doesn't actually exist in reality too often, although there is the jaffle. But anyway, we won't go there. But this is evidence, if you like, of this notion of a mixity, which is central to Australian conceptions. And I've compared this to the Italian case, where I argue the concept of ethnicity in popular academic and policy frames is completely absent. And I argue this makes notions of Italianità and mixity much harder to foster. So in contrast to the spaghetti pie, in Italy, you find a push to ban the sale of ethnic food in the historic centres of Tuscan towns because they will contaminate or pervert, snaturare. They will pervert the authentic Italian identity. So my hypothesis is that the rejection or lack of the ethnicity concept in Italy results in a lack of language to imagine mixity in Italianità. And I've said this to audiences of young Italian scholars, you know, when will Italianità include Somali, other, you know, and they look at me and it's a big jump for the imagination. The lack of language to describe mixed identity was forcefully commented on by, and I hope I pronounce her name right, Cecile Kyenge, a non-Italy born person, the first non-Italy born person elected as Minister of Integration. And in one of her early speeches in 2013, she actually forcefully states this. You know, she says, I am Italo-Congolese because I belong to two cultures, two countries that are inside me, and I could not be entirely Italian, I could not be entirely Congolese. This also explains my double identity, explains what I bring with me, as well as, so this is the first thing by which I would like to be identified. And I think it is right for many people who are part of this country to start to use the right terminology and also the right ways to refer to people. This will strengthen our identity. This is really controversial, and she had a huge backlash. And it's hard for Australian scholars to understand what this statement means in an Italian context, because to us it's so familiar. Because as John Kinder's paper showed us last evening, words have different meanings in different times and places. And Peggy Levitt, a migration scholar, has argued, for example, that we need to do a better job of incorporating how the history of race, ethnicity, or nationalism in a particular place shapes how these words are used and what they ultimately capture. And I learnt this the hard way, because I was assuming an ethnicity discourse when I was living in Italy, which just wasn't there. It took me a long time to work that out. So that was a bit of a sidestep. Let me come back now to transnational families and caring. I'm also interested in how new media and technologies of travel and connectivity have a role in identity formation, as well as to connection to people and place. So connecting to place and forming identity via technologies is interesting to consider, and how this impacts. So we can connect to place now in ways that we couldn't do before. This is a Google Map visit with an elderly man in a residential care facility, which was just transformational for him, really, and I'll come back to that example later. Even more compellingly, new technologies are essential to caring for people across distance, and I will focus in the next part of the paper on transnational care and the role of new media in facilitating what I call care across distance. Because unlike proximate families who live locally to each other, transnational families have no choice but to employ various modes of communication technologies as well as visits in order to exchange this care. So my key argument in this work is that notions of care have been implicitly theoretically tied to proximity. We assume that in order to care, you need to be proximate, you need to be physically present. But now we have the ability, I argue, to experience co-presence across distance in virtual, proxy, ambient, and imagined forms. And all of you are probably familiar with This, and many families do this extremely well. And sometimes when I speak to non-migrant audiences, I'm confronted with skepticism that this is even possible at all. So I've got one more conceptual slide about how I define co-presence across distance. What do I mean by caring across distance? And to do this, I want to introduce the anthropological notion of kinning. Since the anthropological definition of kinship was unbiologicized by Schneider, scholarship on the issue has shown that ideas about the family are formed not on the basis of what is given, or blood, but on what is done, performed, and exchanged. Anthropologists of adoption in particular have shed light on the process of becoming kin. Howell's concept of kinning was first used to describe the way an adopted child becomes part of the adopting parent's kin. Howell defines kinning as the process by which a newborn child, or a previously unconnected person, and in the context of migration research, I would add a disconnected person, or a person separated by distance. How that person is brought into a significant and permanent relationship with a group of people that is expressed in a kin idiom. In her view, kinship is something that is necessarily achieved in and through relationships with others. So people can reject their kin. He's not my father. He's not my daughter. He's not my son. The main argument here is that kinship ties do not exist a priori, but are negotiated on a daily basis through diverse activities, with caregiving being the most significant of those activities. Marshall Sahlins, kind of big king guy in anthropology, has recently reasserted these ideas about kinship which he argues is entirely a cultural construction, even when it's biological, because the social bonds of kinship are culturally constructed. For Sahlins, kinship is a form of mutuality of being. Mutuality of being. Kinfolk are persons who participate intrinsically in each other's existence. They are members of one another. And what I try to argue with caring across distance is that people can share mutuality of being through these new technologies despite distance. So in researching transnational ties and connections to place across a century of Italian migration, I want to explore how this has changed over time. And it's certainly evident that kinship ties may be lost or wither away without mutuality of being, without facilitated connectivity and negotiation. But equally, there is evidence also, compelling evidence, for how ties remain strong despite years of separation. So transnational family research challenges the assumptions around the importance of physical proximity as a normative ontological expression of kinship that distant and transnational care challenges. Okay, enough conceptual stuff. I don't know that I've got time to talk to you much about methodology, but these are the research projects I've been involved in, particularly with Italy, and I can come back to that maybe in question time if you want. But I want to begin the more ethnographic half of the presentation with my favourite quotation out of literally hundreds of interviews collected to date. When interviewed about her transnational family life, a grandmother in Ireland commented, "When my uncle migrated to Australia in the 1900s, we held a kind of wake for him in the local pub because we didn't know if we would see him again. So a wake is an Irish funerary rite." In other words, her uncle's migration was a kind of social death. She went on to say that in contrast, when her nephew left for Australia a few years ago, his departure inspired the family to buy a new computer. So this quote captures the radical transformation in our experience of migration from a type of social death to the purchase of a new computer. So in the next section of the paper, I explore the development of this polymedia environment over the century of Italian-Australian migration and its impact on kinning and caring for people and place, both here and there, from smelling and tucking the letter under your pillow to the virtual kiss on Skype. So let's begin with the pre-war cohort. The pre-war cohort, you have to imagine now a time when connection between people in both places was reliant on letters and letters alone. And for some people, the cost of a stamp was prohibitive, as the first quote reveals. And I'm reminded of the wonderful images of the boat travel, 4 weeks, was it, to visit home? That's where our long service leave in Australia comes from, enough time to get home, 2 weeks the family and back again. That's where long service leave in Australia comes from. The second quote highlights the work of imagination, or what I call imagined co-presence in retaining ties. So Dino coped with loneliness during his 8-year stint away from family as a timber worker in WA, a very common period of time to be separated from family, by evoking his wife's image and that of his small child. And he writes a letter to his wife and he says, "I think of him, Silvio, his son, and see him in every moment of the day, just as if I were with you, trying to forget how far away I am. And at the end of the day and after my hard work, I can't have him before me. Everything that made me happy, listening to him, seeing him, playing with him. And instead for now I have to content myself with thinking of him and imagine he's in front of me, happy and mischievous, just how he was, and I escape into my thoughts and am happy." So the mutuality of being relied heavily on imagined co-presence, on letters of intimate sharing, and of assigned roles, the good father, the good wife. And you can see the importance of seeing and listening, the senses, which are all now possible on new media through Skype. So we need to imagine a time without these things, when imagination was all people have, and some of you remember these times, I'm sure. In Jackie Templeton's beautiful collection of pre-war migrant letters from Sondrio and Australia, she writes, "The letters reflect the writer's preoccupation with their families, their financial or property interests that those families are managing, and friends and neighbours. But mostly there were expressions of loneliness, missing and longing for family and comfort. We could say they were calls for more kinning, more mutuality of being, concern that they were losing that kinning." So here are some examples. Frustration at not being kept properly informed. I want to know how much there still is in the bank and what the countryside looked like. And tell my son Vincenzo to write proper letters and let me know all the family news, as you don't tell me enough. And even if you don't get a letter from me, write all the same, saying what you need and what's happening. So a craving for intimate detail. Frustration at not being appreciated or understood. After 8 years in the bush, Francesco wrote, "I got the letter the other day from Melania, in which she tells me that you're all well. This was a great comfort for me, and the rest of the letter was a great torment, as she told me to come home so that we could all be poor together." And this final quote is actually from my grandfather. "You say you are displeased to hear that I waste my money on beer and amusements, but what do you expect? I can't find myself a suitable girl, so it's better to enjoy yourself while you are young. And last Friday was my birthday, and my hand is still shaking because of all the booze I drank myself." Such intimate details, and a way of sharing, that mutuality of being. He was writing to his sister, who was opening the remittance packages and noticed something missing that month. So these pre-polymedia times were characterised by communication patterns that were more likely to provide limited impressions of distant kin, rather than clear knowledge about the actual person, and people craved intimate details and knowledge of the everyday, although some of these examples do defy that lack. Letters could actually work extremely well in keeping the ties strong, and there's an extraordinary example provided by Sonia Chanchan's edited collection of the letters written by Antonietta Petris and her fiancé Loris Palma in the months between 1948 and 1949. This book is not yet published, but I had the honour of reviewing it and the permission to use it today. Guess how many letters these lovebirds wrote to each other in an 18-month period? Guess. 200, 200, going once, going twice. 450. 450 letters. So here are some of the quotes. Even today, I clearly see myself writing diligently to Loris during many a late evening. To Loris, I describe everything about me, all my activities and thoughts in a given day. It felt as though I was sitting next to him and I could hear his every breath. Yet alas, how far we were from each other in reality. What made this all possible was our determination, our love, and the letters that kept us in touch despite the enormous distance between us. The flow of letters must be constant, lively, and continuous, because if one day that disappears, it would be over. I reread the letter that you wrote in Venice, an affectionate letter as always. I can honestly say now that distance does not lead to forgetting. Actually, it leads to deepening, as you say, love and affection. Yes, I feel that I love you more and more. On Saturday, I received your last letter, written on the 10th of this month, and then nothing. I know I am demanding. You will remind me that it's only been 4 days since I have received word from you. But these 4 days have been eternal for me. I hope to receive a long letter from you tomorrow. The hardships we are facing must be relieved by our writings, and especially by your writings of love. These are crucial to me. They are essential and they give me moral and physical strength. It's 11 at night and silence reigns in every corner of this home. Everyone is sleeping. My eyes won't close. Why is that? It's easy to guess. I think of you. I want to be near you. I write to you. Only when I write to you do I feel you close. And that is the most explicit they ever got. There was no sexting. Now, not everyone had the experience of the young lovers, and like the letters in Templeton's book, most people bemoaned the inadequacy of letters, as evident in this case. This is post-war now, but we're still relying on letters and very costly phone calls. Federica and her family have generally maintained close and regular contact, although there have been what Federica describes as dark periods when she did not feel as emotionally supported as she wished. I felt that, well, I might as well be dead for them because, you know, I'm so far away. So that's social death. The sense of isolation was exacerbated by contact being primarily by letter and infrequent phone calls, which gave Federica an unsatisfying level of detail about daily events. I want to know exactly what's happening. And like during the visit home, I used to find out that this happened, that happened, and I was reproaching my dad for not telling me. Also the negative things, like somebody died. These dark periods diminished as phone calls became more affordable. And I've only got just a couple of slides of the post-1970s period because really up until the polymedia revolution, they're really quite similar to the pre-war. Federica's experience captures a key theme in the post-war and post-1970s cohort until the polymedia revolution. And these dominant themes were worrying about the cost of the call. And here Nina, referring to 1971, says, you know, a big salary back then was $13 a week, but a phone call was $1 a minute. So you do the maths. And the other key theme was not sharing information to protect loved ones. You know, so I went on the visit and I found out that somebody had died. You know, why didn't they tell me? This, I think, is bemoaning the lack of mutuality of being. There's this risk that kinning is not happening properly in order to protect people, but at what cost? So she had the dark periods. She suffered from periods of depression. At the same time, there's lots of evidence that lack of frequency of contact did not necessarily diminish closeness. So being close can be done in the mind as well. Again, the imagined co-presence. So let's fast forward now to contemporary times. And of course, the thing about contemporary times is it doesn't matter what cohort you're from. We're all now in contemporary times and we all have polymedia environments, although there is a digital divide, and that's what my Aging and New Media project is about. But first let's talk about the new migrants, and I did a couple of interviews with some new migrants, and in stark contrast, the transnational imaginary that characterises distant family relations today is constituted by polymedia environments that facilitate synchronous co-presence in real time, in which a form of self that more closely approximates the actual self can be exchanged, along with the possibility of a continuous feeling of being there for each other. So Andrea's case represents a common pattern of transnational care today. Andrea is studying in Australia, and his parents are young, old, and quite independent. His mother, Anna, sends him texts every day, even too often, bemoans Andrea. She's always sending me these stickers on Vida, they're kind of silly, but for her they're a way to tell me that she's thinking of me and that she's caring about me. Andrea feels he has to reciprocate by sending stickers back to his mother, but he has trained her to accept that 1 or 2 a day is enough. Andrea says that he has had to become religious about the weekend Skype call. You have to have a really good reason to skip the call, like you were dead. So what a contrast to social death and now bemoaning social life. So this contemporary set of experiences is equally available to all, but is marked by the technological divide. Andrea is also exchanging emails with his mother and some of his extended family, including his cousins, who is about his age, and his close friends. He maintains a Facebook page and checks the pages of his friends and family both in Italy and Australia. He feels he has a pretty good idea of how everyone close to him is getting on, and that he wouldn't necessarily know any more if he were living in Italy. But the other thing to say about these contemporary experiences is that Andrea, like many of his contemporaries, visits home each year or every second year. The role of the visit in sustaining transnational family support networks is not to be overlooked, and the increased co-presence across distance facilitates increased visits, which facilitates increased co-presence across distance. So we shouldn't compartmentalise the virtual and the real. They're really interconnected. And I've got 5 minutes. Yep, okay. So just to summarise the differences between the pre-polymedia and the polymedia environments, previously co-presence was irregular, costly, asynchronous, intermittent, and relied on formulaic or imagined roles. So the narratives were broken, the kinning narratives were broken. Today we have daily, multiple SMS, regular emails, phone calls, affordable visits, synchronous, continuous or ambient co-presence. This is the idea that you've got your phone in your pocket, so sort of in an ambient sense, they're always with you, even if you're not actually talking to them right now. So these are continuous narratives that approximate physical co-presence. I won't go over some of the other findings, except to say that we didn't expect this, but the new technologies have expanded migrant support networks compared to the past, including the involvement of men and young people. So in the past, the men and the young people sort of signed the name on the end of the aerogram or the postcard. But now they set up the technology, they're the custodians of the technology, and you have cousins setting up technology for their older kin and suddenly forming relationships with each other when in the past they wouldn't have had occasion to even meet. So the expansion. But I want to end with some reflections on my most recent project on ageing and new media. And I've been spending my time in residential care facilities, in particular what we call in Australia ethno-specific facilities, specialising in the care of migrants, Southern Europeans in this case, where over half the residents are Italy-born. Some are second-generation Italian from the pre-war period, so they're a heterogeneous group. However, even in what are some leading examples of residential care, the living rooms are still prone to being vortexes of apathy, inactivity and boredom, with high rates of social isolation. That quote by the man who said, "I feel like I've migrated again," loss of contact with social networks. You know, people don't even have landlines in their rooms anymore because you're expected to have a mobile phone. So suddenly your daily phone call to your daughter in Melbourne from Perth or wherever doesn't happen easily. So my project's been about addressing the policy gap in digital literacy and drawing on my previous work, which I've just presented, about the transformative role and potential of new media to increase social connectivity and virtual community and so on and so forth. So the Ageing and New Media project experiments with various new media interventions. And one such activity is the Google Earth Visit Home. And I can't really tell you just how... Is that because I'm over time? I can't really tell you just how transformative a visit home can be in these dreary lounge rooms. You know, it encourages nostalgia, conversation, sharing, not just between the residents, but between the staff and the residents. It humanises everyone. And you know, the most touching, where there's not a dry eye in the house, is when there happens to be a daughter and a granddaughter visiting, and they visit home with Nonna, and they might be visiting home for the first time together. It's virtual, but you know, Google Earth is amazing. You can get to Street View and you can see the house, and Nonna tells you all about it and takes you to the church where she was married and baptised, and you know, it's amazing. But I want to tell you about the very first Google Earth session I ran, and the very first woman I invited to travel home on Google Earth. Trust the ethnographic process to tell you what you need to learn. I'm not sure the punchline will actually work on this non-WA audience, but let's see. The conversation went like this. Where were you born? Sicily. Do you remember the name of the town? Of course, Torrenova. Shall we visit there? Oh no, I'm not interested in going to Italy. I want to go visit Geraldton. Geraldton? Where I went when I was 14 and lived there all my married life to my wonderful husband. You're not interested in visiting Italy? No, there's nobody there. But this is a woman who chose, she's a 1.5 pre-war generation, so she arrived as a teenager. This is a woman who chose to go into Italo-Australian specific care, and she defines herself as Italian and Australian. So my point here is that I think it's a testament to the success of multicultural policy, and to return to my earlier argument, the importance of the ethnicity concept, where being Italian-Australian is an identity, including an identity around which specialist aged care policy is built. Another similar example, that one I might come back to about dementia and what you remember. But this one, this is unclean data. I literally read the transcript on the plane over. You know, she says, I went back and I couldn't recognize anybody anymore. And I said, quando ho lasciato Italia ero contenta di tornare. Ritornare a casa, la mia patria è qua. Sono italiana, ma la mia patria è qua in Australia. So older Italian Australians who you might imagine are Italian, want to be in Italy, want to be here, but want to be in Italo-Australian care. Just my last slide. Some older people are really wired. So this Lina, look at her telephone bill. Can you see in the course of 3 days she's phoned Outer London, Bologna, Margaret River, southwest of WA, Argentina. She loves the phone, she loves Skype. So she's an example of how fuller life can be if older people are connected. Another woman, a bit like her, you know, she told me, I get on the tube a lot. She means YouTube. She Skypes her sister every day and shows her knitting, you know, mutuality of being, like detail. So that's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is people like this woman who are really scared of new media, and I encouraged her to Skype her daughter-in-law who lives a long way away. And I'm never sure if these people really know what my project's about, you know, digital literacy, digital citizenship, what? And, you know, this lady's going in and out of dementia a bit, and after the Skype call to her daughter-in-law, she turns to me and she looks me in the face and she says, that was better than my medicine. You know, she understood, you know, what I was trying to do. So that's what we're doing. This man, there's a number of men like this man who are in residential care not because they need to be. He's actually fit, well and healthy, but his wife died before him and he can't look after himself. So he's really bored out of his brains, and so he just loves the session. He's the first one there, and you know. So let me end by saying that I'm now working on this notion of digital kinning, a bit inelegant, I know. If you've got a better word, please tell me, which I think is talking about how we kin through virtual media. I think digital kinning helps to problematize the dichotomy between proximate and distant care. I'm always trying to challenge that ontological assumption about proximity and care. It highlights how support networks can be transformed through the use of new media into transnational social fields that bring the diaspora worlds of the migrants into the everyday worlds of the locals. I am interested in the fact that older people, much like their other care needs, like eating and dressing, need new media and digital literacy to be facilitated. And the lovely paper by John Hadjek and Bresin kind of had the same finding. But I also think that, and this is my final comment, that we can also look at digital kinning of place and community, and that's where I want to go to next. But I'll leave you with this meme. Thank you.